Hello, and thank you for joining us for another MuleSoft webinar. Today's demo-focused topic, Drive Digital Business Transformation with Anypoint Platform. My name is Aaron Landgraf, and I am a Senior Manager in Product Marketing here at MuleSoft. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few brief logistical items. First, a recording of this webinar will be made available to you within a few hours of the live event. If, during the course of the demonstration, you have any questions, please submit them via the questions button. We will not be hosting a live Q&A at the end of this presentation, but we'll happily follow up with you after the live event. Should you have any detailed use case questions, please submit them to our dedicated team of experts at mulesoft.com/ask. Finally, we encourage you to engage with other viewers with hashtag MuleSoftWebinar. And now to our speaker, Tyrone Borromeo. He's a solutions consulting lead at MuleSoft with expertise in service-oriented architecture, middleware, application infrastructure, business process management, data integration, mobile, and cloud computing technologies. He has 16 years of enterprise systems integration experience from IBM Corporation, Oracle Corporation, and BEA Systems, doing client-facing solutions architecture, systems implementation, technical sales, consulting services, and research and development. Before I pass it off to Tyrone, I wanted to set some context for his demonstration. First, a statistic. For 63% of senior executives, the pace of digital transformation inside their own organizations isn't happening quickly enough. Organizations know they need to transform in order to compete, but aren't able to execute at the speed their business demands. Why? Many organizations struggle to bridge the innovation gap represented here with this white space. You need to connect your assets to the audiences that most need them. Assets on the left-hand side, audiences on the right-hand side. But traditional ways of thinking about integration and service-oriented architecture often can't get you there. What you need is an agility layer to fill the white space, providing the speed and productivity you need to accelerate your pace of innovation while reducing the cost of change. Anypoint Platform was designed to address this need for agility. That's why MuleSoft customers are able to move 2 to 5 times faster than they could with their traditional approaches to integration and SOA when leveraging Anypoint Platform, specifically to deliver on transformative initiatives like orchestrating data for mobile applications, creating new partner channels and communities, integrating SaaS, or building micro-apps for employee productivity. In this 30-minute demo, Tyrone will cover the broad set of capabilities available out of the box with Anypoint Platform, from SOA to SaaS and APIs. He'll do so by walking through a sample digital transformation initiative that touches on challenges we see across a broad range of initiatives, including heavyweight manual and batch processing, difficult to access legacy systems, a proliferation of SaaS, and ultimately, difficulty extending out to a mobile device, data specifically. So even if you aren't thinking along the lines of HR modernization, there will be plenty of best practices and food for thought for you to take away. More importantly, he'll use this project to begin laying the foundations for an agile IT infrastructure that can more quickly deliver on future business needs, something that I'm sure is very exciting to many of you on the line today. So Tyrone, take it away.
In this demonstration, we will walk through the broad set of capabilities provided by MuleSoft's Anypoint platform to help organizations increase productivity and business agility. Using an HR modernization project as an example, we will take a look at how to establish a base architecture to modernize IT assets, make these assets reusable across various projects, and expose these as shared IT services to internal and external audiences to enable innovation and rapid delivery of IT initiatives across the organization. Let's first take a look at how to establish a reusable architecture. The goal here is to be able to define a base architecture as the foundation for your existing modernization and integration projects with future integrations in mind. Let's explore how we can use the Anypoint Studio, which is MuleSoft unified development tool for APIs and integration, to modernize existing IT assets and expose them as easy-to-use APIs. We will then see how we can orchestrate these assets, whether these are legacy systems sitting on premises or software as a service running on the cloud, using graphical tools like the Visual Flow Editor, the Visual Flow Debugger, and the Anypoint Data Mapper. We will then deploy these to a unified runtime with a shared development, testing, and production environment, all managed by the Mule Enterprise Management Console. Let's take a look at how this is done. So in our scenario, we want to be able to create a simple, easy-to-use API on top of our HR system. So to be able to do this, we create an API here in the Anypoint platform for APIs called Employee Services, version it as 1.0, and basically define this using an API designer. So to be able to structure the API, we make use of a RAML definition. RAML stands for the REST API Modeling Language, right? It's basically the standard that we follow for defining easy-to-use APIs that follow the design-first approach. So going back here, if we click on the Edit in API Designer, we will be brought to the RAML editor where we can basically construct the definition of our APIs by basically describing the resources and the operations for each resource. So in this example, we basically designed a CRUD API for creating, updating, deleting, and retrieving employee information. So you actually see it here in the console on the right, which basically gives you a preview of how the design looks like, from a consumer's perspective. You can see the documentation. You can see the various operations you defined, like the put, the post, and the get. And you can also see how to basically operate that API. You see the requests, the responses, and you can even try it out. One of the nice utilities here is basically the mocking service, which allows you to mock up the API even without it being implemented yet. So you can basically test it out, right? So from a developer's perspective, they can go on and implement their applications based on this API without being dependent on the full implementation of the API. So here you see how we basically invoke the mocking service where it returns the data that we defined here on our API design. After designing the API, I can now package this up for implementation simply by clicking on export files here on the top. So this will produce a zip file that basically contains the RAML definition that you created, as well as the included JSON objects. Let's now switch over to Anypoint Studio to take a look at how the API was implemented. What you see here is a Mule project that was generated by the API kit based on the RAML that we defined earlier. Notice how it uses an HTTP inbound endpoint to accept requests, which it then forwards to the API kit router. The API kit router then routes the request to the specific backend flows based on the type of operation being requested for. So the API kit generates backend flows for each operation defined in the RAML. So you see the put, the delete, the get, and so on. The way we implemented this is by using the database connector as well as the Anypoint data mapper. In this example, our legacy HR system that we're trying to modernize is really a MySQL database. So we made use of the database connector to connect to that database. So notice here, if we take a look at the database connector configuration, how we use select statements in the database connector to retrieve the employee information. We then use the data mapper component to transform the database format into a JSON object, right? So like in this example, what you see in the left is the database format transformed to the object on the right, which is in JSON. This is how we're exposing the APIs. All right, let's give this a spin. To see the API in action, let's launch the server in debug mode. I'm going to click the bug icon over here. This will basically launch the embedded Mule server within Anypoint Studio in debug mode. And this will allow us to test our APIs, and see like how, like what it returns using the API console. It will also allow us to use the Visual Flow debugger to help us understand, how messages are getting processed from one processor to another, right? So notice here, if I click on the console tab, basically start the embedded Mule server. Mule is up and running. And it also launched the API Kit console because the project that we created was based on a RAML. So it basically generated this API console, based on the RAML definition, right? And it's the same look and feel from how we actually designed it in API Designer previously. So now we can actually test out the APIs, like using by going through each operation. So let me maximize this real quick, and then let's click on the get operation over here. Notice that it basically gives us information about the request, the expected response, and the ability to try it, right? So if I click get, this will actually execute the API. So if you recall, the API is actually implemented using the database connector, which basically retrieves the data, and the data mapper, which transforms the relational format to JSON, right? So here you see the employee information retrieved, in standard JSON format, right? And this is how we're unlocking the legacy system. Like underneath the covers, it's a MySQL database, but from the API's perspective, we don't care about that. It can be anything. It can be a legacy mainframe system. It can be SAP. It can be PeopleSoft. It can be whatever. From a consumer's perspective, it's an API that's easy to use like this, that basically returns data in standard format like JSON. So let's see how this works with the Anypoint Visual Flow Debugger. So let me minimize this. And back in the flow, let's add a breakpoint just before we transform the data into JSON format with the data mapper. So I'm going to right click on the data mapper component here, and I'm just going to say toggle breakpoint. So this will basically stop the flow before we transform the data. So let's run it again. Let's go back to our API console over here, and I'm going to hit the get. And this time, rather than returning the results instantaneously, notice how it got intercepted here in the middle of the flow, right? So by doing this, we can actually see what the payload is before we did the transformation. So notice how the database connector returned the data in a linked list format, right? So we basically get like a map of key value pairs over here. So if we take a look at this list, we see the employee information, with all of the records, with the key value pairs to represent the columns and the corresponding values, right? So if I click on resume, we will then see the data transformed back into JSON format, and we get our data, back in the API console, like what we saw earlier. Now that we've modernized our HR system using a set of APIs, we can now include them in our overall orchestration that we need to do for employee onboarding. So first of all, let me close this API Kit console, and then let's switch through this other Mule project where we have like three flows that implement the necessary orchestration, to complete the onboarding scenario, right? So the first flow basically accepts the employee information and forwards it to our internal API, the one that we created a while ago, right? We basically make use of the data mapper to transform the data into JSON format and then forward the request to our IT services queue. This queue will in turn call the second flow, which proceeds with the orchestration for on-premise systems. First of which is a web service for generating an email address and account information for the new employee. So here we see the web service returning this new information, which we then keep in a message variable that we use in our message enricher, right? We basically take that data and merge it to a new canonical representation of our employee information in XML format. So here you see the use of data mapper merging the two sets of information into a canonical representation of employees. From here, we then transmit the employee information to a couple of messaging queues depending on the type of employee. So remote employees go to this mobile equipment queue, and office-based employees get routed to this desk allocation queue. Lastly, a third flow gets called to facilitate the user accounts necessary for the cloud-based applications. So in this example, we make use of Salesforce as a CRM. So if the employee belongs to the sales department or the support department, the employee will be created in Salesforce as a user, right? To be able to do this, we make use of the Salesforce connector, where we specify the use of the create operation for the user object, right? And this is where we basically can introspect the various operations in Salesforce, as well as the various objects, right, including custom objects, right? In this case, we selected the user object, which in turn will be introspected and used in our data mapping. So you see the data mapping here. allows us to load our employee information into a user object in Salesforce. Right. Lastly, we basically use the SMTP endpoint as well as a Twitter connector to basically welcome the new employee to the organization. With Anypoint Studio, we've seen how we can rapidly implement the necessary orchestrations and integrations for our HR modernization initiative. We've also seen how easy it is to create APIs for our legacy HR systems. Now let's take a look at how we can move these projects into a shared development, testing, and production environment that will be part of our base architecture that we're going to establish as a foundation for our current project as well as future projects. To be able to do this, let's take a look at the Mule Enterprise Management Console, where I'm going to log in as admin. The Mule Management Console provides a unified interface to managing and monitoring your Mule infrastructure. So if I click the Servers tab, you will see how we set up our environment with a dev server, a test server, and a production cluster consisting of 2 Mule servers to form a highly available production environment. The applications we created have been deployed to our dev server. So if we click on the dev server link here, you will see our 2 applications, the employee onboarding application, as well as our employee services application, which contain our APIs. We can take a look at the individual flows by clicking on the Flows tab, and here you'll see the specific flows for implementing our APIs, as well as for orchestrating the various services. The Flow Analyzer helps us monitor and audit our flows. So here I can click on a server and select an application that I want to monitor. So let's pick our employee services application, and let's enable auditing on a few flows here. Let's pick the flows that implement the get operations. So let's select the start button over here so we can start analyzing the flows. So now to give this a spin, let's take a look at let's call the API from another browser tab over here. So I'm going to click on the employee API, which will basically call the get operation to retrieve all employees, right? Now if we look back at the Mule Enterprise Management Console, here you'll see that we actually gathered some messages, right? So in this example, we have a message because of that API call, which basically accepted the data. We see here the data mapper transformation, transforming the data from the database into the JSON objects, right? So you can actually see the inbound properties, as well as all the variables that are being used by this flow. To summarize what we have so far, the Anypoint platform provides several tools that can establish a reusable architecture for enabling the foundation for productivity and agility. We've seen Anypoint Studio with its visual flow editor and debugger, the Anypoint data mapper for graphical data transformations, the API kit for easily creating and testing APIs, as well as the Mule Enterprise Management Console for setting up your development, testing, and production environments, and providing visibility in these environments. All these components are part of the base foundation, which will be reused for future integration projects. The projects we created can then be used as common patterns that can be replicated in succeeding projects. APIs we defined can be documented and shared in an API portal. The data models and projects we created can be templatized as reusable assets. This is part of establishing a set of common patterns standardized by a center of excellence. Once this is established, we can then store these shared resources in a shared repository for reuse by other developers. And this will help them build integrations faster. So to illustrate this, what we're doing, with the Anypoint platform, let's take a look at our template library. The template library can provide a starting point for implementing your Mule projects. Rather than starting from the ground up, you can start by reusing an existing template that has already been created based on integration best practices. Existing projects can be stored in the template library for sharing across other projects. To reuse an existing template, all you have to do is click on the Open Template Library icon over here. This will basically give you a list of templates that you can reuse. In our case, we are loading users into Salesforce. And supposing we have a use case that requires merging the user objects in Salesforce with the employees we have in our HR database, we can do a search for existing templates that can help us implement that type of logic. So I'm going to do a search for Salesforce as well as users to find available templates that I can reuse. In the list on the right, I see the Salesforce connector, which I'm already using, but I also see a list of templates that I can open up in Studio. There's a Salesforce and database user aggregation, which seem to be very similar to what I need. But I also see a list of other templates, org-to-org user aggregation. I have a Workday and Salesforce worker aggregation in case I'm using Workday. Let's say I want to reuse the Salesforce and database user aggregation. All I have to do is click on this Open in Studio link. This will download a template into Anypoint Studio and open it up so that you can customize and reuse it. So here is the template showing the logic of querying existing users in Salesforce and aggregating it with users in the database. So I can start from this template and speed up my development work rather than building things from the ground up. Now that we've created common patterns and shared resources with a center of excellence to maintain our standards, the next step is to define shared services that can be leveraged by consumers. Our consumers can be both internal or external, so it makes it ideal to have a hybrid IT platform that can provide easy access to our shared services from inside or outside the network. The Anypoint Platform provides this hybrid environment with a combination of Cloud Hub, our integration platform as a service, and the Mule ESB, which both utilize the same runtime, providing flexibility in setting up your shared service layer. To take advantage of the hybrid IT platform, we've deployed the onboarding application on the cloud in Cloud Hub, while keeping the internal API on-premise to keep it close to the legacy system. In this scenario, let's take a look at the onboarding application deployed on Cloud Hub by clicking on the onboarding application link over here. Here you see a quick dashboard to give you an overall view on how the onboarding application is performing in the cloud. To give this a quick spin, I'm gonna invoke the external API using a portal application to onboard a new employee. So here I have a new employee ready to get onboarded. I'm gonna click submit. This will basically trigger the API running on the cloud. So this is basically our shared service that's being used by this onboarding form. So here we get like a reference number back from Cloud Hub indicating that the onboarding request for Larry Jones has been submitted. So going back to Cloud Hub, if I take a look at Business Insight, you should basically see a new transaction come in. So in this example, we see the flow begin and the information for Larry Jones has been accepted. So we then provision the onboarding process across the on-premise systems going to the internal API running on-premise. At the same time, we orchestrate the things running on the cloud. So here we see provisioning going on for Salesforce. And then lastly, we see the onboarding completed. So let's take a look at what happened here underneath the covers. First, let's take a look at one of our on-premise system, which is the ActiveMQ messaging platform, where request for provisioning of resources for the new employee takes place. So here we have a couple of queues. And if we take a look at the desk allocation queue, and we sort it by timestamp, we see that the latest one is this one for Larry Jones, which basically includes the information we submitted, as well as the generated email address and username. So this is all happening in the on-premise environment. At the same time, we're orchestrating things on the cloud. So if we take a look at Salesforce, and if we look for the new user that we created, Larry Jones, if we click on J here, we should see Larry Jones now as a user in Salesforce. So we were able to orchestrate both on-prem and a SaaS application in the same flow. And then lastly, to conclude the flow, we welcome Larry Jones to the organization using the Twitter connector. Let's take a look at Twitter, and here you see the welcome message welcoming Larry to the organization. So with this, we see a shared service being invoked on the cloud with interaction with an on-premise integration platform in a fully hybrid environment. Having shared services in a hybrid IT environment paves the way for IT as a service, in which our IT capabilities are now exposed as business services that our external consumers, such as our customers or our partners, can leverage. With the Anypoint platform for APIs, we can easily define easy-to-use APIs for our external consumers to make these available for mobile and public use, but with well-established governance and security models. We can define SLAs and control consumer access using a set of out-of-the-box policies. We can also monitor how our APIs are being consumed using API analytics and dashboards. With this, we are able to establish IT as a service to target mobile applications in our third-party communities. Let's take a look at how we're managing the employee onboarding API on the Anypoint platform for APIs to expose this as an IT service that can be consumed by related organizations for their employee onboarding needs. Governance can be enforced by applying a set of policies. In this case, we see a rate limiting policy that's SLA based, as well as an OAuth 2 access token enforcement policy. Developers can log in to the API portal to view various types of documentation on how to interact with the API. They can use the RAML console to directly interact with the API as well. They'll be able to see the various operations, see the request responses, and even try it out. They can request access for their applications through the portal by clicking on the Request API Access link and selecting the application and a corresponding SLA tier. The API owner can define these SLAs. So if we go back to the SLA tiers over here, we can see the various SLAs defined for these API. API owners can also approve and reject requests for access for this API. As you see here, some have been approved already and some are still pending. Lastly, full visibility on API consumption is provided through API analytics, giving better control of your IT as a service platform. So over here, you can see request by date, request by location, and the top applications consuming your API. We've gone from establishing a reusable architecture to setting up common patterns, shared resources, shared services, and finally creating IT as a service. The Anypoint platform provides the components you need to enable productivity and agility in your journey towards IT as a service. This concludes this demo, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tyrone. What you just saw was an example of how IT can become more agile to better partner with the business in delivering on digital transformation initiatives. When we look at our most agile customers at MuleSoft, we see that their agility is often driven by this notion of bimodal IT, an approach that helps organizations move faster without compromising existing investments. Ross Mason went into great detail on this approach in his webinar, Connect Faster to Drive Value, which I encourage you to watch if you haven't already. What Tyrone just walked through is a path these customers have taken on Anypoint Platform to extend their investments with an agility layer that helps them move faster, drive organizational productivity, and reduce the cost of change. Once this agility layer is in place, IT can connect assets to audiences like API consumers, who when involved early can drive more highly productive development cycles, thus accelerating the pace of innovation and change and ultimately driving better business outcomes. MuleSoft's Anypoint platform is this agility layer. For those that joined us late, a recording of this webinar will be made available to you within a few hours of the live event. We will not be hosting a Q&A, but should you have any detailed use case questions, please submit them to our dedicated team of experts at mulesoft.com/ask. We encourage you to engage with other viewers with the hashtag provided, and finally, we look forward to having you join us on the next MuleSoft webinar. Thank you.